Hey everyone, so today I'm going to be showing you how to create relationships between your entities using Spring Data JPA. So first of all, this is our starting application. We're going to have subjects that we can create. We're going to also be able to create students, and we're going to be able to create teachers. So with the relationships, we want a subject to have many students and a subject to have one teacher. And a student can have many subjects, and a teacher can also have many subjects. So that's where we're starting. So just to show you what we have as a starting point, we basically have a student entity that has an ID and a name. We also have a subject entity that has an ID and a name, and we have a teacher entity that has an ID and a name. So then for each of these entities, we also have a controller. So we have a request mapping for students that we can basically use to get the students and create students. We have the same thing for subjects, and we have the same thing for teachers. So I didn't want to write all this code in this tutorial because this tutorial is mainly focused on using Spring Data JPA to create relationships between these entities. So as well as the controller is reaching out directly to our repository. So I wouldn't normally do it like this. I would usually have a service in between the controller and the repository where some business logic could go. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I think it's fine. But if you're going to be using this, then it might make sense to have a service in between the controller and the repository. So each repository is very simple. It just extends the JPA repository, and we don't create any extra methods. So it's the same for all three. So now in our configuration, in our POM, we are using a H2 in-memory database, and we also have the Spring Starter Web and the Spring Starter JPA. So if you're creating this from the Spring Starter in the browser, then you basically need to use these starters, the JPA, the web, and a H2. So by default, whenever you use H2, it has this scope of runtime. I took this out because we basically want to be able to use view the database in the browser. And to do that, we can use this configuration. I'll make this to the next line so you can see. And this is basically allowing us to view the H2 console in the browser. So my application is running here. I've created my three entities. So we can actually connect to this in the browser using that, using this configuration. And you wouldn't want this enabled in production, obviously, but it's quite useful for debugging. So here we can see we're able to get our students, and as you can see we created one a minute ago. We can also view our subjects, and we can view our teachers. And this is just going to be useful, this debugging capability, because we're going to be creating relationships between these three entities. So we want to be able to see how those are mapped into actual tables. So now that we have our kind of basic setup explained, we're ready to get started with the relationships. So first of all, from the subject side, we know a subject is going to have many students, and a student is going to have many subjects. So let's create that relationship now. So first of all, from the subject entity, we're going to have a set of students, and we're just going to call this enrolled students. And let's initialize it as a new hash set, because we want to start it off as empty. So let's just import this, and we want to make this private, and let's just create a getter for this as well. Okay, so now we have this private set of enrolled students, and we have a getter. So let's just move the getter to the bottom. Okay, so now we have this enrolled students on this side. Now from the student side, we need to create the relationship. So from this side, we're going to have another set, and this time it's going to be a set of subjects, and let's just call it subjects. And again, let's create a new hash set for that, and let's import that, and the same thing again, let's make it private and generate a getter for it. Cool. So now from the subject side, we're going to start to create the many-to-many relationship. So to do that, first of all, we're going to use this @ManyToMany annotation. And this is going to define a many-to-many relationship between subjects and students. But in order to do this, we're going to need a join table. So this is going to create a new table which is going to join the subjects to the students. So the name of the table is going to be student enrolled. And now we need join columns. So this is defining what columns are going to be joined inside the table. So we need to use @join column. And first of all, it's going to be name is subject ID. So this is saying we're going to create this new table called student enrolled, and it's going to join using the first column, which is subject ID. And then we need to use an inverse join column, which is again @join column. And this time it's going to be name is equal to student ID. This is going to create a new join table which has one column of subject ID and another column of student ID. And this is going to create the relationship between them. So now that we have the relationship from the subject side to student, we need to do something on the student side to define the same relationship. So let's just move the getter down to the bottom again. And this one isn't quite so complicated. So we can just use @ManyToMany, and we're going to say it's mapped by enrolled students. So this is just mapping the relationship. So this enrolled students needs to correspond to this instance variable here, enrolled students. So this is created the many-to-many relationship where a subject has many students and a student can also enroll in many subjects. So how can we use this now from our API? So from the controller, we're going to create a new endpoint. And just to clarify that this tutorial is basically mostly around the JPA relationships, and it's not so focused on the API. So this mightn't be the most restful way to do this, or the best way to do this, but it's just a way to do this. So that's why we did it. So we're going to create a new put mapping, and this put mapping is going to have an endpoint of /subjects, which is defined here, and then we're going to use subject ID, and then we're going to say students, and we're going to use student ID. And this is going to return a subject, and we'll just call this method enroll student to subject. As we can see, we've defined two path variables, subject ID and student ID, so we're going to use them here. The first path variable is subject ID, and that is going to be a long because we've defined the ID of subject as a long. And we're going to need to do the same thing for student ID. So now we have our two path variables. Cool. So now we're going to basically need to get the subject, get the student, and then assign the student to the subject, and then save that. So that's what we're going to do here. So first of all, we're going to get the subject. We already have the subject repository auto-wired here, so we're able to use that. So we're just going to say get one, and we're going to use the subject ID to get that. So again, if you were actually building something with this, you would need to cover the case where this subject mightn't exist. So you might need to put some extra error handling, but we're not going to do that in this tutorial. So now we need to do the same thing for student. But as you can see, we don't have the student repository yet. So this is normally why I would use a service in between the controller and the repository, because it's a bit strange that the controller has access to the student repository, which is actually outside its domain. So usually I would use a service class to do the connection there. But for simplicity here, we're just going to do it all from the controller. So we have a student repository. We're going to use that student repository. And again, we're going to get one by the student ID. And I just saw up here, this shouldn't be getting a subject by the student ID. This should be getting a subject by the subject ID. So now that we have that, we're going to use a method called subject.assign or .enroll student, and it's going to pass in a student. So now we just need to create this method, it's going to be quite simple. So we already have the enrolled students set here, so we can just use that. Enrolled students.add, and we're going to add the student that we passed in, like that. So going back to the controller now, that has got rid of that error. So now we just need to return the subject. But first of all, we need to save it. So we're going to return subject repository.save, and we're going to save the subject that we just enrolled the student to. So that should all work end to end. There's going to be one problem here, and I'm just going to run it to show you the problem. So because a subject has many students, and a student has many subjects, whenever we use this through the API, we're basically going to have this recursive problem where it's going to display all of the students enrolled to a subject, but then it's going to display all of those students' subjects. So it's going to be kind of this recursive issue. So first of all, let's see if it works, and then you should be able to see that problem that I'm talking about. So it all runs okay, which is a good sign. First of all, again, we're going to create a subject. First of all, we can see we have this enrolled students, which is empty, which is a good thing. Then we're going to create a student. We can see it also has subjects as an empty list, but as we're going to see in a minute, this is going to cause us a problem. So now let's just get the subjects. We can see we have this subject called math. It has no students yet. So now we're going to use our endpoint that we just created to basically enroll a student to the subject. So first of all, it was a put method, and it used the subject ID, and then it used /students and then the student ID to enroll that student in the subject. Let's just rename this to enroll student to subject. I like to keep all of my requests in Postman because it just saves me a lot of time in the future. I don't need to create these things again. They're basically all stored in this collection, which is just useful. So now if we do this put to assign the subject or enroll the student to the subject, we can see this recursive problem. So as we can see, it's showing the students that are enrolled to the subject, but then it's also displaying those students and their subjects. And this is a recursive problem. And we can see it's actually thrown an error here. So there is an easy way around this. From the student side, we basically don't want to display the subjects that a student is enrolled in. We still want this relationship to be there, but we just don't want to display it. So we can use an annotation called JSON ignore to do that. So if we stop this and start it again, we should have everything that we need. So in 1 second when it starts, we're going to make the request, post to subjects, which creates this subject. Then we're going to create a student. We can see that. Now if we get the subject, we can see it has no enrolled students yet. Now if I enroll the student with ID 1 to the subject with ID 1, we have an error. So let's just see what's wrong there. So after a little bit of debugging, I found the problem. So it's related to this getOne method on the repository. So this is something to do with this being a lazy method. So it doesn't actually receive the subject here. It's getting a reference or a lazy reference to that. So instead of this getOne, we're going to just use findById.get. Because findById is returning an optional, so we need to call get on that. And again, this isn't related to the relationship at all. If you were doing this properly and you were building a production system, you would need to handle here what happens if a subject with this ID doesn't exist or a student with this ID doesn't exist. You would need to handle those cases. But for this is fine. This is just an example to show the JPA relationships in action. So this should be fine. That was an interesting problem that I didn't come across before. So now going back to Postman, let's see if it works this time. So we're going to create our subject. Then we're going to create our student. And now if we get the subjects, we can see that there's no students enrolled. Now if we put the student to be enrolled to the subject, we can see that the subject now includes John, which we enrolled as a student. And now we can do get subjects to see that. So one interesting part of this now is we can use this H2 console to basically connect to our database and see what's happening here. So once this connects, we can see that we have our tables here, and we can see we have our student, our subject, and our teacher like before. But we now have this new table called student enrolled, which was basically created as a result of this join table, student enrolled. And it basically creates a many-to-many relationship between subjects and students. Because now if we see this, we can see that we have the subject and the student related here. And that's what's doing the magic for us. So if we were to create another student, and let's call him Simon, here, so we've created another student, and now we want to enroll Simon as well. So let's do this put to. So now we can see that enroll students has John and Simon. If we were to go back here now, here, and run this, we can see that we now have both of them. So they're both enrolled in the same subject, and we have the two student IDs here. So that's cool, that's working. So that's our many-to-many relationship finished. So now we want to create a one-to-many relationship between teachers and subjects. So a teacher can teach many subjects, but a subject can only have one teacher. So this is a little bit different to before, and it's actually easier in my opinion. So let's take a look at that. First of all, from the subject side, we're going to have this field called teacher. So we're going to again create a private field. It's going to be teacher, and it's going to start off just being null, so that's okay. So now on the teacher side, we need to have subjects. So we're going to have a private set of subject, and again we're going to initialize this as a new hash set. If I initialize that, we need to give it a name, I guess, subjects. So let's do that. Cool, so now we have a teacher with subjects and a subject which has one teacher. So now with the relationship here, on the teacher side, so the teacher needs to have @one-to-many, and we're going to map this by teacher. So this is defining a one-to-many relationship between teacher and subjects. So a teacher can have many subjects. Again, like before, we would have this recursive problem. So let's just assign the JSON ignore annotation to this as well. Now on the subject side, we have, let's first of all just create our getter, because we're going to need a getter for that. Cool, and let's just move that to the bottom, because we like to have all our fields at the top and our getters and setters at the bottom. Cool. So now on the subject side, we had this teacher, and again let's just create a getter for that. And let's put that down below. Cool. So now let's give the annotations for this. So we have a teacher, and this time it's many-to-one, because there's many subjects, and they each have one teacher. But one teacher can have many subjects. So this is how it differs from before. So many-to-one here is going to be a little bit easier because we don't have a join table. First of all, we're just going to pass in cascade equals cascade type.all, and we're going to use this join column. So the name here is just going to be teacher ID, and the reference column name is going to be ID, because it's going to use the ID of the teacher for that. Cool. So again, that's everything done kind of at an entity level. We have this relationship defined. So now in our controller, we need to define a way to actually use this. So let's just copy this one because it's going to be quite similar. Again, this tutorial is not about REST. This is just about the JPA relationship. So there could be a better way to do this from a controller point to make it more RESTful. But let's just do it like this for simplicity. So we've just replaced this path variable to be called teacher ID. So So let's rename it here as well. And let's just change the name as well. So let's just say assign teacher to subject. So we're going to be getting the subject like before, and now we need to get the teacher like this, and let's use the teacher ID to get that. So now we need another method here, and this is going to take the teacher as a parameter. And now let's just say assign teacher. So now if we create that method, this is just going to be basically saying this.teacher equals teacher. And again, we are just going to be saving that. So this shouldn't be using the student repository. Again, this would be happening normally at service level, but for now, let's just do it at the controller because we don't want to create another class. So let's just use the teacher repository like that because we need to use that to get the teacher. So let's use the teacher repository to get that. So this is everything. We should be able to now assign teachers to subjects. And we're going to see how this relationship is a little bit different even at the table level. So I forgot to rename this. Again, it's just me going too quick. So this put mapping should actually have teacher here because we basically have two endpoints serving the same thing. So that was my mistake. So now that we have these unique endpoints, this should hopefully work. So it started up. We're going to do the same thing again. We're going to create a subject. We're going to create a second subject. We're going to create a student. We're going to create a teacher. Now if we get the subjects, again we have two subjects. Neither of them have a teacher or enrolled students. We can get the students, we should have one. We can get the teachers, we should have one. And now we're going to try to enroll the student to the subject. So let's see now. So now we've been able to enroll the student to the subject. So we can see enrolled students has one student called Simon, and it doesn't have a teacher yet. So let's copy this and first of all rename it to assign teacher to subject. And it doesn't need a payload. It's a put, but it doesn't need a payload. And it's going to use the endpoint subjects, the ID of the subject, and then teacher, and the ID of the teacher. So if we send this now, it should just be teacher, singular. So we can see now that we have this really cool relationship now where the subject has enrolled students, which is a list, and it has one teacher, which is Mr. Smith. So we could actually do something interesting here. We can create another teacher called Mr. Pat. And if we create that teacher, we have this teacher called Mr. Pat. So now this teacher, we could actually change the teacher here to 2. So now we can see we've just been able to change out that teacher. And we can also assign this teacher to the second subject which we created, which was math. So now the second subject has the teacher, but it doesn't have any students yet. So this is really nice. This shows that the teacher is able to be assigned to multiple subjects, and multiple subjects can have the same teacher. So now, just to finish out, we're going to take a quick look here and see what our tables look like. So first of all, we have students. Let's run that. We're going to need to connect again. So if we look at the students first, we still have one student called Simon. If we look at the subjects, we have 2 subjects, and these have a teacher ID. And this is because it's one-to-many, we didn't need this join table like we had before. So we can see that the subject table itself contains the teacher ID. And now if we look for teacher, we should have 2. We can see we have Mr. Smith and Mr. Pat, and then we have this join table, which was used for the many-to-many relationship between subjects and students. Thanks for watching. This was quite a complex tutorial on JPA relationships, or building relationships using JPA. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.